I'm Jane Alexander, Nantucket Book Festival alumna, welcoming you to At Home with Authors.
In 1848, Susan Veeder took a leap that no other woman from Nantucket had ever taken before. She boarded a whaling ship with the captain, her husband Charles, joining him on a 4.5-year voyage to the Pacific and becoming the first ever whaling wife of Nantucket. Susan Veeder documented her journey with detailed notes and vibrant watercolors in a diary. A century and a half later, that diary crossed the desk of Betsy Tyler at the Nantucket Historical Association and became a launching point for her to discover the thrilling, challenging, and ultimately tragic story of the Veeder family. Betsy Tyler's new book is called 1,000 Leagues of Blue. She joins us on this episode of At Home with Authors in conversation with Mary Bergman, the Nantucket Book Festival's historian in residence and festival chair.
You begin the book with an epigraph from Moby Dick, which I'll read. Now the long supplication of my youth was answered. That serene ocean rolled eastward from me 1,000 leagues of blue. So how did you come to pick this line to set the mood of the story that you were telling?
Well, I was thinking about a title for the book, and I didn't want it to be just The Whaling Voyages of blah, blah, blah. It's a little boring. And so where do you go for a good whaling quote or a good quote of Moby Dick, of course. And all the Nantucket quotes have been so used and overused. So I went to the Pacific chapter, which seemed to make sense, and read this sentence and thought, oh, that's it, 1,000 leagues of blue, because blue just has so many connotations besides being the Pacific Ocean. There's blue, the sadness of blue, and also sort of the lewdness of blue, which comes into play with the Captain Veeder part of the story. So that seemed to sum it all up. And then the thought that Susan Veeder probably her whole life wanted to go to the Pacific because she had heard her father, her brothers, her husband all talk about their whaling voyages to the South Pacific. So I think it was a long supplication of her youth too, to go where they had gone and to see some color,
Instead of gray shingles.
Yes. I think she was probably certain times of the year, like all of us, starved for color, and she was an artist. So 1,000 Leagues of Blue appealed to her.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting, and I'm just thinking about this now, which is that so much of your career, at least what I know of it, has really been focused on Nantucket's history, a lot about the history of the built environment of the island. And so and with this story, you too get to leave Nantucket and
Yes.
away. So
right.
what's the experience of that like, of kind of following a Nantucketer away from the island?
Well, I've read lots and lots of whaling logbooks and journals, so it's not my first trip, but Nantucket's still the heart of the story. It's about the community of Nantucket and what this industry did to families and people who lived here, especially women. So I was kind of excited to be on the voyage with Susan. I wish she had been a little more, open about all her experiences. We have to imagine some of it. I wish I knew really why she decided to go, if it was her decision. But yeah, it was fun. It was fun to look at each place they stopped along their voyage and to try to find out more about what that particular island or port was like in 1850 or 1852. And the research took me all over the place. So.
And you actually went on a sailing expedition yourself?
Well, not sailing, steaming, really.
Oh.
Well, I don't know if it was steaming. It was a freighter, combination freighter cruise ship. Odd little combination. The ship called the Aranui, which when I was thinking about writing this book and thinking, how can I possibly write about a place I've never been? What is it like to be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on a ship? I didn't know. So I started looking at that area of the world where both Susan and Charles on his later voyage spent so much time, and that was Tahiti, the Tuamotu Archipelago, and the Marquesas. And there just happens to be this ship that is a supply ship for the Marquesas that sails from Tahiti, or goes from Tahiti, every 3 weeks. And it takes about 100 passengers and freight, all kinds of freight for the people of the Marquesan Islands. And it's a 800-mile trip through the Tuamotu Archipelago. So it's exactly where I wanted to be. And it was such a cool trip. And I just said to my husband, I'm thinking about writing this book. I really need to go here. And he's like, okay.
Yeah, but twist my arm.
Sure, let's do it. So it was worth the trip. And I did a little research in Tahiti, or I tried to, at the archives in Papeete, but I needed more time and I needed a better translator to actually have any luck there. But just the environment, just to be, on the water or on those islands was such an amazing experience. And I think it helped me just feel more close to the story.
In the book, you talk a little bit about when you were working at the Nantucket Historical Association and you were the director of the library, and it was the 90s and you were bidding by phone with the auction house on the Cape to get Susan's logbook. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or was that your first entry into Susan's story?
Yes, and that was in 1995, and I was librarian at the NHA, and this journal kept by a Nantucket woman on a Nantucket ship came up for auction. It had been in private hands, and the Friends of the Nantucket Historical Association, who are still a very active group, came up with a purse of $10,000 to try to get this journal, which absolutely belonged on Nantucket. So prior to that, I saw the journal on microfilm. I don't know if anybody has ever examined primary source material on microfilm, but it's in black and white. It's on a reel. You get dizzy looking at it. You don't get the full impact of it. But I knew even from scanning through it how important it was. We all did. So I was asked to come in on a Saturday morning and bid by phone. And I'd never done that before. And this is before internet and before cell phones. Sit there on the phone and keep throwing out money to see if we could get this journal. And I was so afraid we wouldn't have enough. But the hammer went down at about $9,500. So the journal came in the mail. I opened it up, and it was such a different thing from what I'd seen on microfilm. You open the cover and that title page, full page color illustrations, and this very intimate experience of holding in my hand this journal that had been on the ship for 4.5 years. She had written in it, when she felt like there was something of note to record. And it was such a personal, almost invasive look into her life. I mean, did she intend for me to be reading this journal? Probably not, but there it was. And it had a real effect on me. I was emotionally caught up in her story because there's some very, very, very sad parts and very exciting parts of this story. Thinking about this woman who probably never left Nantucket in her life. She got married when she was 17. She had her first child when she was 18. She's bound to the home. And then at age 32, she gets the opportunity to go with 2 of her children on the ship and leave everything she knows and just see what it's all about.
Yeah. It's hard to, I think we, especially now during this, period of time, think of Nantucket as being isolated. Thinking about what it's like to be physically isolated. Even just, to go to the Cape is now something you really have to think about. Do you want to do? Do you want to get on a boat? And it's just fascinating to think about somebody's life then, where how the intensity must have just been dialed up so much to really be able to leave and to enter that men's sphere too. Right.
And she was the first Nantucket woman to do that, to leave from Nantucket on a Nantucket ship, 1848. It's not like friends of hers had told her, oh, this is a great thing to do, go do it. She was it. So pretty gutsy, I would say.
Yeah, I guess just speaking to the larger, theme of women on whale ships, I think of, Captain Ahab had a wife, and a little bit about what's written about women in the whale fishery. And how rare was it for a woman to be on a whale ship?
Pretty rare. The 1850s was sort of the period where there were women at sea with their husbands. Didn't happen much before that. There were only, from Nantucket, about a dozen women. There's a woman, Melanie Reed, who did a dissertation on women, whaling wives, as they are called. And she researched and discovered there were 33 Nantucket women. Many of those had married New Bedford whaling captains or captains from other ports, and they had sailed. They'd moved away and sailed from those ports. But those who actually lived on Nantucket their whole lives and who went to sea with their husbands, only about a dozen. And, not all of them kept journals. So it's a very rare thing to find a woman's whaling journal, especially one that's illustrated.
Yeah. Thinking about the illustrations, do you have any inkling as to how Susan Veeder developed that talent, or when that? Sorry, my cat is.
I see your cat.
when she, do you see her talent progress throughout the journal?
Well, the scenes do get more intricate.
Let's hold.
Okay. The scenes do get more intricate as she gets to bigger ports. Like once she gets to Tahiti, and there's a harbor full of ships, and there's, she paints all of that. And she does it in such great detail that I think that she must have had some sort of training, and I looked at what schools were available on Nantucket when she was a child. She was born in 1816. Public schools weren't in place till 1827, but there were a lot of private schools, and there were mariner schools that taught depicting rigging and that kind of thing. There was a William Wilkes Morris advertised in the local paper that he taught ship drafting. And I found a journal that he kept, which is in the NHA collection, where he lists the names of some of his students. I mean, Susan's not in there, but he did teach girls as well as boys. So it's possible she studied with somebody like him and learned how to do that very intricate ship portraiture that she does. Maybe her brother studied with him, came home at night, did some sketches, and she sat beside him and learned how. I don't know, but she was really careful about how she depicted that spider web of, lines that are so fun to look at.
Yeah. I think when we think about, this dichotomy between the people who were here on Nantucket and the people who went to sea, I think there's this idea that being at sea is the ultimate freedom, that you're able, right? That you're able to explore the world. You're leaving the kind of the confines of the Quaker society here. But on the other hand, when a woman is at sea, not only if she's there, if her husband is the captain, it's his word is doubly law, right?
Exactly. Yes.
He's bound to him. So I'm wondering if you could talk about kind of the, were there freedoms were women more free if they stayed behind on the island or if they went to sea, or what might that have been like?
Women weren't free. I mean, they were second-class citizens. They could not vote. They could not hold public office. A lot of things they couldn't do. But many of the women who were left at home when their husbands went to sea, or not many, but some had a power of attorney. And with that power of attorney, they could legally do anything. They could buy and sell property. They could take out a loan. They could do anything their husbands could do. So they had some freedom. I mean, they had opportunity, and I think many of them thoroughly took advantage of that. I remember researching one family, one woman whose husband went to sea, gave her a power of attorney, and a week later she sold the house. So there was more freedom, I think, if you stayed ashore and if your husband was gone, because he had the ultimate control, especially if he's the captain, like you say. I mean, his word is it. And I guess it depends really on the relationship between husband and wife, you know. In Susan's story particularly, she refers to him as the captain. For 3 years in this journal, he's the captain, the captain, the captain, the captain. And then they've been in Hawaii for a while, in Oahu. They went to a circus, they went to a ball, they had some fun. And then the next day in the journal, he's Charles, and he's Charles the rest of the journal. It's like, what shifted here? Something in their relationship must have, that she feels comfortable calling him Charles on the page, you know. Who knows?
I mean, I don't want to give away the whole story. I think people should buy the book and read it. But their relationship shifts a lot throughout. There's a big shift, and I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, or how.
Are you referring to his last voyage?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I do want to talk about that because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I can talk about kind of how I got there, if
yeah.
In 2010, I was working on a book that accompanied the exhibit of Susan Boardman's amazing embroidered narratives of Nantucket women, and we were discussing this exhibit and her work and sort of choosing the women across 4 centuries of history that we wanted to talk about. Of course, the whaling women were central, and Susan Veeder was really central because she'd influenced Susan Boardman as much as me. So just the simple thing of writing about Susan Veeder, I'm gonna wait for the sun to go through here. I needed just to put in parentheses her husband's life dates, very simple thing, born in 1809, died when, and I couldn't find it. You know, it's like there's no obituary in the paper. It's like, what's going on here? He's a really well-known, successful whaling captain. Why isn't there something about him in his later years? He'd been a selectman. He held some public office. He was one of the founders of the Pacific Club. He was like a well-known guy. So what happened? So I was looking through death records, the town's death records, which is a really fun thing to do year by year. And in 1878, I see Charles Veeder, place of death, Society Islands, 1878. I thought, oh, okay. So he must have been on a voyage. So I looked at, there are all these compendia of whaling voyages. It's easy to find what ships the captain took to sea. And so I discovered that his last ship was the William Gifford out of New Bedford, which he took out in 1868, but the ship returned in 1872. His death date's 1878, so ship came home under a different captain. What's going on there? So I thought, well, if there's a journal kept on board the William Gifford, a logbook or a journal, that should tell me what happened to the captain. He was old, and for a captain, when he took this last ship out, he was 60 years old, and that's for a whaling captain, and that arduous work, that's really old. So I thought he got sick. He probably got sick and stayed on one of the Society Islands, which include Tahiti and Bora Bora and Lahaina, and died there. That's probably what happened. So called New Bedford Research Library and talked to the librarian there. And she said, oh, yeah, there's a journal kept on board the William Gifford by this young man, Edward J. Kerwin, and it covers the last year of the voyage of the William Gifford. And I said, well, could you just take a look at it, go to the end of it, and see if it says anything about Veeder? So she calls back and says, you've got to read this. She said, this is amazing. She said, I'll just read you parts of it. And I went, oh my God. So she sent me microfilm. This is before the blogs were digitized. And many of them are being digitized now, thank God. But she sent the microfilm, and I went into the little microfilm room at the NHA Research Library, and I started reading this journal. and just exclaiming, "Oh my God," because scene after scene after scene was just insanity on board the ship. So, so just looking for that death date led me to this story of Captain Veeder's last voyage, the last year of his last voyage. And that's when I thought, there's a book here. This is just such an amazing tale. It's the kind of thing journal keepers don't usually write because it's very scandalous and, you know, could get you in a lot of trouble if the captain found it. So, so yeah, it just led me down that road. And it's a really, you know, it's so unbelievable that it needed to be corroborated. And there is a report from the American consul in Tahiti in 1872 that corroborates everything this journal keeper wrote about Captain Veeder and his shenanigans and his endangerment of the crew, his liaison with a native woman, his drunkenness, his, you name it, it's all there. It all happened. And Nantucket kept quiet about it. Nobody ever, nothing in the newspaper. So,
Wow.
it's a story that I thought needed to be told.
It's interesting because I think we certainly have, you know, we like a triumphant narrative when we're thinking about our history. And you have, you know, seen a lot of Nantucket's history and lots of, so I wonder, are there any, you know, I'll edit this out as I think. Is this a story that you think, oh, how are you going to say this? I mean, again, I'll probably edit this out, but just, I think it's incredible that the NHA published this too.
Why is that?
I mean, something that Nantucket wanted to bury these kinds of stories, but now we don't.
We don't.
Yeah, and
It's also, I mean, it's a story of the downfall of this man, but it's also the story of the resiliency of his wife and of his family and of the community that must have surrounded her with some sort of, you know, care.
Yeah. Do you have any idea what her life was like after that?
Yeah. I mean, she, as I was working on this book, the newspapers were digitized, you know, from 1821 till the present. So I had this whole new resource for studying the lives of these people. And it immediately is a keyword searchable database. So I just typed in Veeder, expecting to find a few mentions, and there were 600 hits. So I was like, oh my God, you know, my God, there's material here. And a lot of it's about Susan and Charles, their son, George, who stayed on the island and raised his family here, and about his family. And then there's more information about Susan, as she kept a journal at home later in life that sort of overlapped her husband's last voyage. So I know a little bit about her life, her friendships, her family. You know, it was a very ordinary life. She also, in the summertime, rented out some rooms to tourists when tourism sort of took off. She lived a long life. She lived to the end of the century. She visited her daughter on New Bedford, who had married a New Bedford man many times back and forth. It's all in the newspaper. So I did get a sense that she, you know, she carried on. She, and then, yeah, I think she is a very resilient woman. And I have to throw this in. She had a power of attorney from her husband. And she had never used it. He had given it to her, but she'd never recorded it. You know, she never had to use it. She'd gotten it in the 1850s sometime. Wow. But in 1872, when news must have come from the consul in Tahiti to the owners of the ship in New Bedford, they obviously contacted Susan, and she went right down to the registry of deeds. She recorded that power of attorney, and she sold all of the property that was in his name to her brother. who later sold it back to her. So she knew how to protect herself, and she did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's an incredible human story, and it reminds us just, that people in the past are they're like us, and I think we can draw on their strengths to see somebody go through, harrowing things and come out the other side, still swinging is
Right.
really incredible. Is there anything you wish you could ask Susan?
Oh God, so much. It's like, who are you making that pink calico shirt for that you said you were making on board the ship? Why didn't you describe any of these women in the South Pacific on these islands, these women that you saw? Why didn't you paint them? Why didn't you tell us more about their lives? What were you thinking? Did you wear that, the typical garb of the day, the long sleeves and the long skirts this whole voyage? How did you do that? There's a lot I'd like to ask her.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think she was a remarkable woman, and I'm not without sympathy for Charles. I mean, something happened. He seemed to be a pretty upstanding kind of family guy. He took his family whaling. He took them to Pitcairn Island and showed them around. He was not a bad guy. But something happened on this last voyage. And he also showed a real empathy to the native peoples. I mean, he liked their way of life, and he did a lot to help them out. He ferried them around from one island to another. He gave them goods. He helped them. And I think he ended up living with them. So I'm not without sympathy for him, but, he's kind of a scoundrel too. And probably a very sick man.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there was no mental health care.
Right.
And I can only imagine what the business of whaling would have done to people, not just their physical health, but their emotional and health, and to be separated from family for so long. I think about, why were there all of these men's clubs formed on the island, and what would that have been like to come back, to leave a society at sea where you're it.
Right.
And then you come back to land and everything has changed.
Right. And you come home and your wife's in charge of it. She's been running the household for the 4 years you were gone. She's been she's been paying the bills, and she's been, keeping the home fires burning. That's her territory. So yeah, probably felt a little itchy to get back to sea where he could be the man in charge.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. If you had to write about or study another community, is there any place in the world that interests you like Nantucket?
Well, I mean, I think every place probably has its interesting history in one level or another, but just Nantucket is so rich in history, and being a librarian and having delved into the archives, at the NHA and at the Athenaeum, and just in the Registry of Deeds, which you and I both love, and all these great resources. There are a few places like this, I think, that have that wealth of information that's accessible. So I love writing about Nantucket. I don't know that it would take a long time to be comfortable anywhere else to feel like, I have the context to do it.
I like, as a researcher myself, listening to you talk about just the different ways in which the story was able to open up to you because of the different primary sources that you were able to access, and how access to archival resources has changed during the period of time in which you got the idea for the story and it came to it. It is interesting that digitization of the Enquirer and Mirror archives is really such a major turning point.
Absolutely. No, it really changed the way all of us who are interested in Nantucket history write about it and research, because there's so much detail, in the newspaper. It's the paper of record, and, just looking at the advertisements can tell you a whole lot about a community. I love doing that. You can anybody should just have fun browsing through these newspapers, because it's a pretty amazing record. And what I did too, I was hoping that I could trace the family, descendants of these people, and that somebody would have maybe another journal, maybe letters, some sort of, other portraits perhaps, but something that would help me tell the story. So I started looking at, the genealogy. Who were the children of Susan and Charles? Who were their children? And then trying to, work it forward, because none of them were here on the island. Using census records and then looking at obituaries and all kinds of stuff, I found my way to Seattle, Washington, where there were direct descendants of Susan and Charles. And I found their names, 3 brothers and a sister, and I chose the sister and found her address and wrote her a letter and said, hey, I'm working on this story of your ancestors, and I'm wondering if you have any family material that you'd like to share, any insights. And she got back to me very excited and said, this is great. They didn't really know anything about the Veeders. The story had been lost. She did not know her Nantucket history. She knew more about, Mary Veeder, the daughter of Charles and Susan, had married a man from New Bedford, whose father was also a whaling captain. His last name was Vinal, Vinal, like Vinal David. So they knew more about that side of the family, but not so much about Susan and Charles, not really anything at all. So she sent an email, we got email addresses exchanged, and she sent them out to her family and to see if anybody had anything to offer. And they really didn't at that point. So, it was kind of a dead end, but it was great to make contact. And then I happened to be out in Seattle a couple of years later, and I got in touch with her and said, could we meet for a cup of coffee? And so she invited me over for dinner. And she also invited her brother and her cousin and her daughters, and it was like a big family group. And it was amazing. They live on an island in the middle of Lake Washington called Mercer Island, in a house that Susan Veeder's grandson, on land where he had built a house. This is a little later house. But anyway, we all sat down and I started talking about Susan and Charles and sort of, opened that closet a little bit, and they were intrigued. I mean, they were very generous people. They were very intrigued. And then they pulled out, they had a letter. They went to look, say, we have a Bible with some names in it. And then we have this letter written in 1945 from Susan Veeder's grandson to his son. And it gave a little bit of family history. And I include portions of that in the epilogue of the book. And the history that they recorded is totally mythology, total mythology, totally not what happened. So it just makes you think about everybody's family and what we hear about, our grandparents and great grandparents, and how much of that is true, how much has been, cleaned up for sanitized, whatever. Because they, what little bit they knew about Charles Veeder was that he had invested with some friends in a ship from Boston to take cargo to Tahiti. Who takes cargo from Boston to Tahiti? And that the ship had been lost, and he was heartbroken and died and was buried in Tahiti. The family story. That he had made this last voyage for his daughter Mariana to bring in a little more money for the family. Mariana, who he left at 8 years old on the waving goodbye, in New Bedford, and never saw her again. So that was a family story. But they all got very interested in it, which is great. And then one of the cousins who was not at this dinner, but who came to Nantucket later, she got interested in her New England whaling heritage, and she visited New Bedford, and she came to Nantucket. I spent a day with her. Dolly Vinal, she was amazing. But then she said, I have an umbrella that has an ivory handle that's carved Charles Veeder. And she said, and my brother has a ship portrait, could be one of Veeder's ships. So, they did have some material, and she donated that umbrella to the NHA. Yeah, so, I tried to trace down descendants of Edward J. Kerwin and of his friend Ed Kavanaugh in New Bedford, and also found material that way. But I'm sure there's more out there. And as more resources are digitized, there'll probably be more pieces of the story that fall into place. I certainly hope so. I'd love to know more about what Charles Veeder was up to for 6 years in the South Pacific.
Well, it really makes me think about the value of keeping a record of your own life. And even if you don't end up doing something fascinating, maybe your friend or your brother, or it's interesting just to think about the value in the everyday. And sometimes I worry as a researcher and as a historian that we're so saturated in the current moment with information. We take pictures of everything. I remember thinking, how are we ever going to know what was important? I've never taken a picture of myself out in front of my house with all my finest clothes like they used to do.
Right.
But, it's interesting to think about what will future historians be looking for and how can we make their jobs easier.
Right, and how will they find it, Where are they going to find it? Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting journals in the NHA collection, it's not a whaling journal, but it's a woman who lived on a farm, and she kept a record every day of everything she did every day. And it's very rare. Who did that? So, she took in sewing. She might have sewed 6 coats, and then she went to a neighbor's house to lay out the dead, because she did that too. And then she, took care of the farm and talked about potatoes. And then she talked about walking into town to see the fireworks. This is all like the 1880s. So records like that are invaluable. Ordinary people, their daily lives. That's what fascinates me more than, the acclaimed people who we know more about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have any projects brewing? I would love to find another nugget, like the journals that tell this story, and that's pretty hard to find. I don't have anything in particular other than the house research that I do all the time, which is my favorite thing to do. So I'm currently, researching some houses. And each house, this is another thing about Nantucket, to really get a feel for the history. You research a house, a 200-year-old house, find out who owned it over time, find out about their lives, what they did, how many kids were in the family, who their neighbors were. And you start, once you've done 200 houses on the island, you have a real sense of the connectedness and the neighborhoods, and it just all comes alive. I know that. You walk down, a side street, and all of a sudden it's like you're back in time. That's the beauty of this place. Yeah, absolutely. So, we've got 2 more things we've got to ask, but I did want to make sure that we acknowledge and thank the NHA, and there was a number of donors who made this book happen.
Yes. Publishing a book is an expensive process. And with this book, I don't have an agent. I just don't have a link into the current publishing world out there. And I'd hope this book would find a wide audience, because I think the stories, could be fascinating to somebody who knows nothing about whaling, who's, not familiar with Nantucket history. But it was really hard for me to try to get in to that world. So, I've worked for the NHA. I've done books on contract for them. They were eager to publish this. And James Russell, since he's become the director, has sort of reinstituted a publication program there. So we talked about it, and I realized that the NHA would allow me to do certain things with this book that a major publisher might not. I really wanted color illustrations throughout. I hate it when they're all clumped in the middle and they're all black and white. I had a certain idea of what I wanted it to look like. And I've worked with a really great graphic designer on other books for the NHA, Eileen Powers. She's amazing. So I talked to James and said, I want to work with Eileen. This is the way I think it would look and feel like a book you want to read. And he was so gracious and said, go for it. So they raised money, a lot of people chipped in to make it possible to print it and have such a beautiful, beautiful book. So I'm really happy.
It is, and it nicely highlights objects in the NHA's collection that are part of this story too.
Well, that was the thing. James said, please go through the collection, find anything that relates to this story, and let's put it in there. So that was fun too, trying to find, illustrations of whales and of Galapagos tortoises and places that Susan and Charles went, and maps of charts of areas. So NHA does have a lot of related material. So that was fun.
That's great. Oops. I think my computer's listening to me because I just got a pop-up from Reddit that says How to Get Into Publishing by Penguin Random House.
Well, let me know.
Yeah, right. We've been asking everybody, every author that we've talked to for this At Home with Authors program, considering all that's going on in the world, there's a lot of unrest. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, whether people, even though they want to think it's over, it's not.
Right.
What out there in the world or in your life, what gives you hope?
Well, I think my garden probably. And I'm thinking back, this is just very personal and local too. And you think back in Nantucket history when whaling went kaput, it just died. Agriculture bloomed on the island. Everybody went back to farming. There were 100 farms, over 100 farms in 1850, all across the island, farms that sold their produce. And then everybody had their own, personal little gardens too. And I'm seeing that same kind of resurgence on a small scale right now. When this pandemic hit, everybody I knew started planting a garden. So I think there's, we go back to the things that we can do to sustain ourselves through hard times. And just the seasonality of a garden gives you hope.